Elliot Dre hated parties. At least the ones in the real world. Sure, he could manage a polite nod, a clumsy handshake, a few awkward jokes at work functions, but his true comfort zone was the digital world. It was the one place where his introverted tendencies didn't seem out of place. And tonight, Elliot was at a party, sort of. He was sitting in his virtual living room, not a real one, but one he'd meticulously crafted in a game that was as much an escape as it was a passion project. Through his VR headset, he could almost feel the warm, ambient glow of the neon lights flickering against his avatar's polished suit. The game was a ridiculous combination of a luxury resort and an alien amusement park, something between the Jetsons and Survivor. Elliot had been in this space for hours, talking to his friends, his digital friends, and mindlessly sipping on a drink that looked like it belonged at a high society gala, though he couldn't taste a thing. But as much as he was trying to engage, the truth was, he wasn't having fun. The conversations were predictable, the avatars were too perfect, too shiny. Everyone was too cheerful, like characters in an over-the-top sitcom. Elliot was starting to feel the disconnect, the kind of loneliness you can only feel when you're surrounded by people who aren't real, but still so damn close to real it almost made his stomach churn. Suddenly, a strange ping echoed in his ear. "Hey, Elliot." The voice was familiar, but not in the way he expected. It was off. It sounded like it was coming from a strange echo in a hallway. He looked around the room, but his eyes couldn't make sense of where it had come from. The virtual island resort spread before him, endless and bright. A mix of grassy hills, futuristic skyscrapers, and hovering cars. He had visited this exact place countless times, but this felt different. "Elliot, come find me," the voice urged again. But it wasn't the voice of anyone he knew. It sounded digital. Glitched. Distorted. What was happening? Curiosity gnawed at him. Was this some new feature in the game? A hidden Easter egg? A secret quest? He powered up the virtual jetpack, giving himself a little boost as he flew toward the towering, glistening skyscraper on the horizon. The voice came again, closer this time. As Elliot reached the top of the building, he saw something he didn't expect. A dark corridor, a stark contrast to the pristine, polished environment he was used to. The walls were made of a strange, shimmering texture. He hovered in front of it, unsure. The corridor flickered like a broken neon sign, sparking in and out of reality, and his heart started pounding in his chest. The voice urged him on, pulling him deeper. Break the walls. Find the path. Without thinking, he pushed forward, flying through the flickering walls, and as he did, the world around him started to distort. The island, the floating cars, the avatars, they all began to warp. The reality around him was stretching like taffy. Buildings morphed into organic shapes, people turned into faceless mannequins, and the sky became an endless loop of garish color. Suddenly, there was a pop, and everything froze. For a moment, Elliot was weightless, floating in an empty void, the digital world around him flickering in slow motion. His heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, he felt it. A shift. It was subtle at first, like the texture of his avatar was different. But then, the virtual environment shifted again, and Elliot realized something insane. He was no longer just an observer of the game. He was inside it. Really inside it. He glanced down at his hands, now shimmering with faint blue energy. The world around him bent and flexed like rubber, like he could reach out and grab it, twist it into anything he wanted. He lifted his hand to test it, and a nearby object, an absurdly large ice cream cone that had been stuck in the air, melted, then reformed into a small, glowing orb, which floated in front of him like a curious pet. Elliot grinned. "What the hell?" he muttered. The orb buzzed softly, like a digital insect, then hovered away from him. Without thinking, Elliot instinctively reached out and grabbed it. The moment he did, a flood of information poured into his mind. This was no glitch. No accident. This was something entirely different, something new. The next few days felt like a blur. Elliot had spent most of his waking hours experimenting with the strange new power he had discovered. It was as if he'd cracked open a door between the two worlds, virtual and real. In the game, he could do anything. He could alter gravity, speed up time, even change the fundamental laws of physics. It was a rush, a heady thrill. His avatar, a sleek, metallic version of himself, glided through the digital world as if he owned it. He became a legend in the game, effortlessly completing missions and quests that would have taken other players hours or even days, but it was what happened when he returned to the real world that intrigued him the most. Elliot first noticed the glitch while cooking dinner. He was flipping through a recipe online, staring at his phone screen, when suddenly, the text began to distort, flickering and then blinking out of existence entirely. In a moment of panic, he reached out to touch the screen, and the distortion seemed to ripple across the surface. For a moment, the kitchen around him appeared to distort as well, like he was no longer inside the cramped apartment he called home, but in a strange new environment altogether. Before he could register it, everything snapped back into place. The phone was fine. The room was fine. But something inside him felt off. The glitches became more frequent. He'd be sitting at his desk, his fingers moving across the keyboard, and then he'd look up to see his coffee mug floating a few inches above the table. His heart would skip a beat, and he'd quickly correct it, but the doubt lingered. What was happening? It wasn't just his surroundings that were changing. It was his own mind. His thoughts would sometimes slip in and out of the virtual world. He'd find himself staring at a blank wall, and before he realized it, the wall would begin to warp like a piece of clay being twisted by invisible hands. At first, he thought it was just a side effect of too much time spent in the game, too much brainpower focusing on things that weren't real. But soon, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was caught between two worlds. One evening, Elliot was sitting on his couch, staring at his phone when it happened again. A shift, a flash of light in the corner of his eye. The walls of his apartment rippled, as if made from a translucent material, and for a split second, Elliot saw something, no, someone. A figure, distant and blurred, standing in the middle of the room. "Elliot," the figure said. It was a voice, distorted but familiar. His heart raced. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure didn't answer but instead gestured toward the doorway. The digital world called to him. The boundaries between it and reality were slipping, and he felt himself standing on the edge. Elliot stepped toward the flickering doorway, his heart pounding. The figure, still blurry, seemed to float in the middle of the room, an ephemeral presence that didn't quite belong in this reality. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, convinced that it was some sort of hallucination or a glitch in his perception. "Where are you?" Elliot asked again, his voice trembling slightly. But the figure only extended its hand toward the doorway. Without thinking, Elliot crossed the threshold. The moment he stepped through, the world shifted. The floor beneath him felt soft, like sand, but when he looked down, it was glowing with an unnatural blue hue. Around him, the air was thick with light and shadow, swirling together like oil and water. It was a landscape both familiar and completely alien, like a corrupted version of the game he had spent so many hours in, twisted into a nightmarish version of itself. "Elliot," the voice called again, now clearer, though still strange and disembodied. The figure was closer now, no longer a mere outline, but a fully formed avatar. It was a woman, dressed in an elaborate robe made of shifting digital patterns, her face a blank canvas with no eyes, only a soft pulse of light where they should be. Her voice seemed to reverberate within his own mind, not just through his ears. "You have crossed over," she said. "You have unlocked the path." "The path?" Elliot whispered. "What is this? What is happening?" "You are no longer just part of the game, Elliot. You have become something more. A transcender. But there are consequences." The woman moved closer, and for a moment, Elliot felt a pulse of cold air rush through him, like a shiver that shook him to his core. His eyes widened. "What do you mean, transcender?" He could barely focus on her words. The space around them was shifting in ways that made his stomach turn. The blue glow around him became overwhelming, and every object, if they could even be called objects, seemed to morph from one thing to another, like a living glitch. The figure didn't answer immediately, but instead waved her hand through the air, and an image formed before him. It was a chaotic montage of what seemed to be both the game world and the real world, overlapping, colliding in bursts of color and strange, static-filled images. There was a scene of his office, then a flash of his kitchen, followed by an odd landscape that seemed to be part futuristic city and part decaying ruins. People he recognized, his co-workers, his family, appeared within the images, but they were distorted, their faces flickering, blurring, losing focus. "This is what you have caused, Elliot," the figure intoned. "This is the cost of crossing too far, of attempting to transcend the boundaries between worlds. Your mind is now torn between them, and it will not hold. You are beginning to lose yourself." Elliot stared at the images in horror. "No, this can't be happening," he muttered, but his voice barely carried over the increasing static in his mind. "I can fix this. I can go back to normal. I just need to reset the game or something. I can fix it." The figure's head tilted slightly, as if contemplating his words. "You can try. But you must understand, normal no longer exists for you. You are too far gone. The boundaries that separated you from these worlds have dissolved. You have opened the path to becoming something different. Something between them." Elliot stepped back, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The dizziness intensified, his vision blurring as though the game itself was pressing against his skull, trying to force its way into his reality. He raised his hands to his head, desperate to make sense of it all. It was like a dream. No, not a dream. More like a nightmare. But if he couldn't escape it, how long before he was consumed by it? His avatar in the virtual world had once been his perfect escape, a way to avoid the mundanities of his real life. But now that he had broken through, he felt as though both realities were suffocating him. Each was incomplete without the other. Each had a piece of him that the other couldn't replace. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice strained, almost pleading. "Please, I need to go back." The figure's expression didn't change, but her voice softened. "You have two choices, Elliot. You can sever the connection, return to your world as it was, and lose everything you have discovered here. Or you can embrace this new existence, accept the consequences, and become one with the flow of both worlds. But be warned, once you step into the flow fully, you may never be able to leave." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a stone. He had spent so many years hiding in the digital world, avoiding his responsibilities, avoiding the reality that he had never quite figured out how to face. Now, it was as if both worlds were colliding, and he had to choose between them. But which was real? Was it the life he had carefully crafted, built from a foundation of carefully chosen pixels, or was it the raw, unedited world he had been avoiding all along? "Will I lose myself?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, the pulsing lights in her face swirling like the shifting patterns of the game. Then she said softly, "There is no self to lose. You are no longer just the person you were, Elliot. You are something more. But you must understand, you cannot be everything. The worlds are fragile, and they are shifting because of you." He felt his mind fray. The edges of his thoughts were coming apart. The glowing blue landscape around him twisted and expanded like an endless void, and the sounds of the world around him became distant and muffled. His pulse quickened, the beat of his heart thudding in his chest like a drum. "I'm sorry," Elliot muttered to himself, feeling overwhelmed, his words tangled and lost in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to break everything." The figure gave him a pitying look, then extended her hand to him, the glowing light pulsing in rhythm with her words. "It is too late to undo what you have started. But it is not too late to choose what comes next. The path you walk will decide everything." Elliot hesitated, his gaze locked on the figure's hand. He wanted to trust her, to understand, but there was too much at stake. His heart raced. His vision blurred. The swirling vortex of the digital and real world began to tear at his sense of self, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it all together. He didn't know what was real anymore. He didn't know who he was. But deep down, something gnawed at him. The choice was clear. With shaking hands, he reached out and grasped the figure's hand. The moment their hands connected, everything went white. Elliot awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. His body felt heavy, disoriented. The world around him was silent, eerily, disturbingly silent. His eyes flicked around, but there was nothing familiar. Nothing made sense. He stood up, unsure of where he was, the ground beneath him feeling solid yet wrong. Slowly, he reached up to touch his face, and his fingers brushed against something smooth, metallic. Panic surged through him, and he turned to look at his reflection. But what he saw wasn't himself. It was his avatar. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sleek, polished version of himself staring back at him, the digital skin that had once been a character in the game now taking form in the real world. His pulse hammered in his chest, and he tried to move, to breathe, to shake himself free from the suffocating feeling of being caught between two worlds. His reflection, his new self, smiled back at him, coldly, as though it had always belonged here. And for the first time, Elliot realized the terrifying truth: there was no going back. Elliot stared at his reflection, his breath shallow and erratic. The metallic, pixelated version of himself grinned back with a cold, eerie smile. He reached up instinctively to touch his face, feeling the smooth surface of his avatar's skin. It was wrong. This was wrong. But was it? The question gnawed at him as his fingers lingered on the cool, synthetic surface. He looked down at his hands, his avatar's hands, smooth and shiny, as if he had been transformed into the digital version of himself. He flexed his fingers, and it was like his whole body responded with a pulse of energy, as if this avatar wasn't just a representation of him but his reality now. A strange, tingling sensation spread from his fingertips, surging through his limbs. It was as if he was still in the game, but now he was the game, each movement causing a ripple in the surrounding environment. The air around him shimmered, thick with a faint, almost electric charge. Was this what the figure had meant? Was this what it meant to transcend? He tried to shake the thought away and focus on the now. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be back in the real world, in his apartment, sitting on the couch, trying to make sense of the mess he'd gotten himself into. But instead, he was standing in this strange, distorted space, this other reality. A reality where there was no going back. The room around him was as alien as his avatar, constantly shifting like a twisted collage of landscapes and memories. The walls morphed from solid to fluid in the blink of an eye, each one now indistinguishable from the last. His eyes darted to the floor, where the once concrete tiles had warped into something organic and flowing, like veins of light cutting through a dark ocean. His mind screamed for order, for something solid to grasp onto, but there was nothing. Nothing except the eerie silence and the hum of something ancient and far too powerful to understand. Elliot swallowed hard, his chest tight with panic. What now? He whispered to no one in particular. His voice, too, seemed foreign, muted, as if it didn't belong to him anymore. He turned, searching for something, anything, that would help him make sense of this. But the space was endless, disorienting, with no real points of reference. The place was a fusion of his memories, distorted fragments of the real world and the digital one, yet neither entirely one nor the other. The more he looked around, the more he felt himself being drawn into the space, like a thread unraveling and pulling him deeper into a vacuum. Then, as if answering his unspoken question, a new voice filled the air, a voice that was both familiar and strange, layered with the same distorted hum that had surrounded him in the glitch realm. Elliot, it called, calm but distant. The voice echoed from every direction, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He felt it deep in his bones, vibrating through his body. His heart skipped. It's time to understand your purpose. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but the disembodied voice had no face, no form. It was just a presence in the space, shifting like the environment itself. You've crossed the threshold, the voice continued. You've merged the digital and the real, and now you are no longer limited by either. You are beyond both. You have become part of something much greater than yourself. Who are you? Elliot demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. He wanted answers. He needed answers. He couldn't keep floating in this void without understanding what was happening to him. The voice remained quiet for a moment, as if contemplating his question, before speaking again. We are the keepers. We are the boundary between worlds, and you, Elliot Dre, are the one who has broken that boundary. You are a transcender now, and there is no going back. A shiver ran down his spine as the words settled in his mind. Transcender, what does that even mean? You were once bound to the limitations of reality, confined to your world. But now, you can see beyond that. You can shape both realities, mold them at will. The voice grew softer, its tone filled with something that felt like both awe and caution. But power comes at a cost. A cost you are beginning to understand. You can alter the fabric of existence, Elliot, but the more you reshape, the more your identity unravels. Your mind, your sense of self, will dissolve into the very realities you manipulate. There will be no distinction between who you were and what you are now. Elliot's chest tightened. He had always believed that the ability to control both worlds would be freedom, ultimate freedom. But now, it felt like a curse. I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted to escape. I didn't want this. You cannot undo what has been done, the voice responded, its tone now unwavering. But you can choose. You can choose how you move forward. A strange calm settled over Elliot as the weight of the situation sunk in. It was as if the room around him had stopped shifting for the first time. Everything felt still. Silent. Frozen. But the choice was still hanging in the air like a fragile thread. His mind raced. Could he go back to being a part of the real world? Could he return to the life he had once lived, the job, the routines, the predictable mundanities that had once suffocated him? Or was this new existence, where he could move between worlds at will, truly the path he was meant to walk? His eyes fell to the shimmering ground beneath him. He closed his eyes for a moment, just to gather his thoughts, to ground himself in some kind of reality. But the more he tried, the less he could feel any sense of solid ground. The lines between what was real and what was not began to blur, and he felt himself slipping. His thoughts were becoming fragmented. Without warning, he felt the shift again. His vision spiraled out of control, and his body began to feel heavier, as if the weight of the decision itself was pulling him deeper into the very fabric of this new existence. His avatar flickered, the once smooth surface of his skin glitching in and out of view, unable to settle. His mind began to unravel with it. He gasped, grasping at his head, trying to hold on to something, anything. But it was no use. His sense of self was slipping through his fingers like sand. He could feel the world around him bending, warping, as though he was not just in one place but multiple places at once. His apartment, his office, the game world, they all fused together, colliding in a rush of color and noise, and then, for a fleeting moment, Elliot saw it clearly. The truth. He could feel it, more than he could see it. He wasn't just losing control of the boundaries between these two worlds, he was losing control of himself. His identity was dissolving, as though he was becoming a part of both realms. No longer a man. No longer an avatar, Elliot screamed, but the sound was muted, swallowed up by the distortion of reality itself. The figure appeared again, standing before him as the chaos unfolded around them. She didn't speak this time, but only watched him, her blank face unmoving. Her presence felt like an anchor, one that neither held him down nor released him. Elliot struggled to maintain his sense of self, but it was too late. The worlds had consumed him. He was no longer Elliot Dre, the man who had once walked the streets of a quiet city. He was now something else, something caught between two realms, a force in both worlds but belonging to neither. The light around him dimmed, and he felt himself stretch, bend, collapse in on himself like a collapsing star. Everything fragmented, and then, with a final burst of light, the space fell away entirely. There was nothing left.